My old mistress promised me when she dies she gonna set me free. Always makes me laugh. Lived so long her head went bald. I don't believe she gonna die at all. I realize the only way I can smile on a picture is if I'm actually genuinely laughing about something.
Clifton Hicks of Blue Ridge, Georgia, thank you for sitting down with me today to talk about banjos and banjo building. The reason I set out to do this series is I wanted to capture people today that are passionate about traditional music. And you've become a phenomenon here, just it seems like overnight, but you're playing at festivals and you're appearing at gatherings, and you're not only sharing your music, but you're sharing your history as a folklorist. You've got background in this. So the reason I'm here today is that I'd like to learn the roots of your passion toward this music.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to have you.
Well, let's start with something easy. You're not from here. This is a beautiful place. I'm going to take some pictures when it stops raining. But where did life start for you?
I was born in Jacksonville, Florida. We moved around a lot. Both my parents worked for government, local government usually. So my earliest memories are in Savannah, Georgia. That's where I learned to walk and talk.
When did you first get exposed to music in general, and then trace it down? How did you get into this music?
My mom played guitar, played cowboy chords and stuff occasionally, and sang some of the classic folk songs. My dad is a big woodwind guy. He's got flutes, harmonicas. He's really probably best at the harmonica, I'd say. His claim to music, folk music fame, is that him and some friends were squatting at someplace in D.C. In Mississippi, John Hurt was in town, and he actually crashed on the same floor as my dad and his other team. They were like 17, 18 years old, and my dad would play harmonica with him just a couple times, which is pretty wild. Dad's story about that is they had reefer and they had whiskey. As long as they could keep the weed and whiskey coming, he stayed there for several nights. But the first time that they ran out of weed and whiskey, John Hurt woke up early, like 4 o'clock in the morning before anybody else woke up, and left. That's the story. I actually grew up like kind of thinking that I hated music because my dad had record players and he had big old wooden speakers, and we lived in a great big echoey house in Savannah, Georgia. It was an old Victorian house that was falling down. He started out with classical stuff, then he got into world music, then he got into sort of American folk music, and that's when he started discovering people like Fred McDowell, John Hurt, Pete Seeger. But I didn't like any of it at first because it was just kind of maybe like a gestalt to me. It was just always in the background. And he was always playing the harmonica or the saxophone or the flute and echoing all through the house. And I couldn't stand it, you know. My mom never played music. I only saw her play guitar maybe twice in my life. I was 13 years old. I had a radio in my room, and there was a bluegrass show that came on late at night on an AM station. And that's where I first heard people like Ralph Stanley, Lester Flatt, Earl Scruggs, Bill Monroe. And so suddenly I really wanted to get in. I wanted to play music. I was already like singing songs. I think the first song I learned to sing was Froggy Went A-Courtin'. My dad taught me that. Long version, all the verses.
Yeah.
So I would sing that, and I got to where I wanted to play an instrument to accompany the singing, because I thought it was kind of silly. Just nobody wants to hear you just sing, but they want to hear you accompaniment. I was repelled by the guitar. I was repulsed by the fiddle. And listening to that show, I heard the banjo. And of course, I mean, bluegrass banjo, a big old whopper resonator, finger picks, and somebody who's a professional, that pulled me right in. And so it wasn't long before I got him to buy me a banjo, and I think he spent $100.
What was it about the bluegrass singing? I mean, you mentioned Ralph Stanley. I'm assuming you were listening to ballads.
Those early classic bluegrass lyrics are just like like heartbreaking a lot of times, or if it's not pure heartbreak, it's pure joy. And how could you not get drawn into it? I mean, these guys were professional at drawing people in. Yeah, the words, but really I have to say what caught my ear was probably the banjo. And it wasn't long before I started buying banjo compilations. There's tons of that. It'd be like Tony Trischka, or people playing jazz or Irish music, Irish banjo, plectrum banjo I was really into before I played.
When did you start to dig into some of the history of the instruments?
I either assumed or somebody had told me that it was an Irish instrument. And that made sense because it was a droning sound. It kind of sounded like a pipe, like a bagpipe. I saw it as a purely white Scots-Irish instrument. And I knew that I was white Scots-Irish kid. And I was like, well, that's the perfect instrument for me. I love it. It's my history. Probably the first time I heard anybody play traditional banjo was on a compilation CD. And it was Ola Belle Reed, and she played Boats Up the River.
Yeah.
And I had never heard anything like that before. And I asked my dad, and I said, what the hell? That's a banjo. It doesn't sound like any other banjo I've ever heard. What is that woman doing? And he said, oh, that's called clawhammer. We didn't have internet yet, so I couldn't just go type in clawhammer banjo and suddenly learn everything I wanted to know. And then I finally figured out that she wasn't using finger picks, and she wasn't playing lightning. She was playing slow, and the banjo was tuned lower, it sounded like. It was a different tuning, it was bassy, it was more mellow and woody sounding, more organic sounding. And I caught the damn fever when I heard that recording of her. And way more than I'd ever caught the fever listening to Scruggs or Stanley or any of those guys.
Why did it touch you so?
I think because it sounded, not only it was beautiful and perfect, but it sounded archaic, it sounded old. And I've always, since I was a little kid, I've always been after the old and the archaic, or what I perceived as authentic. I discarded my finger picks. I think I actually threw them away. And 3 fingers, I dropped it to 2. And I figured, so instead of planting 2 fingers and playing with 3, I'll plant 3 fingers and I'll simplify it, and I'll come up with a 2-finger picking style with no finger picks. So I was doing that by the time I was 14. And then, when things really changed for me, my mother drugged me out to see a guy named Ernie Williams. He was playing at a festival down in Florida where we lived. And Ernie Williams is from Alabama. And he learned to play from some old-timers, tradition bearers around Sand Mountain, Alabama. And Ernie, not only did he played the straight drop thumb overhand banjo, he sang. He belted out. I mean, he sang like he was lead belly, like he sounded like a trumpet. And that was the first time I saw the style. It wasn't long before I was at Ernie's house. And it wasn't long after that by going to the folk festivals around Florida is when I found out about George Gibson. George Gibson's from East Kentucky and grew up in the tradition. I mean, George was born in a log house in 1938. His dad was a banjo player. He had aunts and uncles and cousins who were banjo players. He had neighbors who were banjo players. So when I met George is when it really blew my mind. That's when I realized that there was, hundreds of different tunings, hundreds of different styles, thousands of songs, archaic, wild stuff. George plays everything from, blues to ballads and canny fables and dance music and stuff. And I think I met George when I was 15. And to this day, I'm now 33. I'm still in close contact with George. I work with him. Anytime he does a presentation or a show, I'll travel with him if I can, and I'll assist. That's been a lifelong apprenticeship with Gibson.
You call it an apprenticeship, which means at some point you become a master?
One thing that George always hammered into me from an early age was George never taught me anything. He showed me lots of stuff. We'd hang out, we'd play music for hours. So it's not about like taking his place or filling his role. It's just sort of, you have to become your own thing, and sort of the tradition that George grew up in. You weren't respected as a musician unless you had your own complete own take on it. I
know that between Ernie and George, you were introduced to what's called the banjo songster. And there's a style there. And I'm wondering if, as an apprentice, are you looking to dig up the history on the banjo songster, to demonstrate the banjo songster? I'm wondering if that's part of your motivation.
Early on, yes. As a kid, I didn't know anything I saw little glimpses of history and little fragments of culture that survived, of the old culture that survived around me. And I thought, my God, I've got nobody else around me that cares about this, nobody my age certainly. I've got to latch onto this, I've got to learn it, I've got to become an expert in it, and I have to revive it and bring it back. I don't see it that way anymore. Now I see it that the past is over, it's dead, the people are dead. I don't believe you can revive what's past. What you can do is you can create anew. You can create your own tradition that builds on what you know, your perception of those past traditions. And you can move forward and hopefully draw people to your banner, which is something I've tried to do, especially in recent years. Draw people to your banner and try to inject some positivity into their lives, which in turn brings positivity to you. Yeah, like what am I trying to do I consider myself a contemporary banjo songster, planting the flag of the traditional banjo songster and saying we're still here.
Mm-hmm. What is a banjo songster? Can you give me a quick synopsis?
You play the banjo and you can sing. Mm-hmm. You don't have to sing all the time, but generally you're singing. In this tradition that I'm after, that I'm trying to plant the flag for, the poetry is more important than the music. I mean, you've got to master this thing, and you've got to be damn good at this thing to tie it all together. And the poetry demonstrates and displays like the culture. I was a Civil War reenactor for 10 years. I did my best to play and sing folk songs, folk music that I thought would have been around back then. You start off, you sing East Virginia, you sing Pretty Polly, you sing all these other ballads. Before you know it, I mean, that's like an hour-long epic that you've recited.
This banjo songster tradition, as I've listened to you on YouTube, and by the way, thank you for posting those videos on YouTube, they're very helpful. What I hear is you sing a melody line, but you play the melody line. Is that a common characteristic of this music?
A lot of times if you listen to recordings of Banjo Bill Cornett, what he's singing doesn't line up with what he's playing. A lot of times he is just laying down a rhythm. Mal Gibson was a prolific banjoist in his day. And a lot of times he would just talk over the banjo. But then also people talk about call and response. I learned a lot of music from Rick Ward. It's fairly standard that he will sing a verse and then play it. Sing and play. A call and response. And that's what he's told me that his grandfather, Tab Ward, told him to do it that way.
As it relates to minstrelsy, do you perform any minstrel songs today? And if you do, what do you do about the lyrics?
When I was into Civil War reenacting, I picked up a copy of the Briggs Manual, which was the earliest minstrel manual I could find. And I learned the first tune out of the Briggs Manual is the Coon Hunt Walk Around. I've never performed Coon Hunt Walk Around. Mm-hmm. I've never performed a blatantly minstrel tune. If I'm on stage, I don't use racial epithets. I don't, for any breed of people. I just avoid it.
We skipped over something. You're talking like an archaeologist. When did you decide to go to school, and why did you decide to study archaeology?
So coming up, there was no money for me to go to school. I had two sisters that my parents put through college. And also, I was a really bad student. I dropped out of high school because they were going to expel me. So I had to go into the Army. I wanted to. And so I got a homeschool diploma, homeschooled myself, and the Army took me. And it was 2003 when I went in, right when the war started in Iraq. Absolutely hated the Army. Hated every minute of it, really. I went to strange places. Everybody was different, but everybody was the same. That's what struck me everywhere I went, whether I was in Iraq or Kuwait or France or Germany or England or Ireland. Everybody was the same on some level. And when I got out of the Army, I could go to college all of a sudden, and that was an option I never in a million years thought I would go. So I enrolled at Appalachian State University. I just assumed I would get a history degree. And I took anthropology classes, and one of my anthropology classes I took was Introduction to Archaeology. And I just fell in love with that. The technical side of actually being able to go into the field to an archaeological site in the woods or in some field somewhere and discovering things that human beings have not touched in thousands of years. There's nothing else like it. I mean, it was everything that I was into. So I immediately switched over to archaeology.
Is it the discovery of those relics Or is it the classification and the ability to bring these relics to others and show them the beauty?
Well, probably a little bit of both. I mean, at the time, it was all about me, my hunger for the mystery and the knowledge and the secrets. Some of the stuff that I was able to work on by going to App State, and then after I got out of App State, I got government jobs working for the Forest Service and the Park Service. I got to work on some really fascinating collections that were already in the lab, and then I got to do some really fascinating field work. A lot of the places I wound up working were in caves and rock shelters in the Ozarks and in the Appalachians. And there's nothing more amazing than exploring a cave and finding somebody's fireplace and somebody's debitage and the bones from their dinner from thousands of years ago. Just absolutely amazing.
What have you learned about humanity?
The one theme that always came up was that everybody's the same. When you're excavating an 8,000-year-old rock shelter site, and these people are extremely foreign to me, you find that, well, they still needed shelter, they still needed food, they still had dogs. When their dog died, they buried him. They ate, they cooked, they needed to stay dry, they defecated. You find all of that stuff. I mean, that's just really what I took away from it, is that we're all the same. When I studied the Civil War when I was younger, and I viewed people that were alive in the 1860s as being extremely remote and foreign to me, and how I could never understand them, and if I was in the same room with them, I might not even understand what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. But when I started learning about ancient cultures, the ancient human past, you have more in common with somebody 100,000 years ago than you could possibly imagine.
What is it about the connection with the past that so inspires you?
To me, that is like maybe like a prism into reality, like into what's real, what we might say is authentic. And for example, on one crew I worked on, I was the smallest, skinniest person on the crew. So if we found a hole in a cave, and we were finding artifacts, and there was a reason to go in there and check to see if humans had left it. Maybe we might find a burial in there that would need to be protected, mm-hmm. Or something like that. I would slip down in the hole with a headlamp or something and check out these extremely remote places where no human has been. And it's if I can get in some place where other humans, who I feel a strong connection to, any human, at an extremely remote time, 8,000 years ago maybe, if I can get in there and find some trace of them, something they scratched on a rock wall, a flake from a spear point that they made, or bones from their dinner, or just charcoal from the fire they used so they wouldn't freeze to death that night that they had to hide in that hole for whatever reason. If I can get in there and just touch where they were, it's just like lightning rushing through my body.
Does that translate to playing banjos and bringing back that tradition?
Yeah. It's like picking up this banjo, which is probably from the late 1870s or the early 1880s. Picking this thing up and bringing it to life is something akin to slipping down a slippery black hole in a cave and finding somebody's corn grinding stone from 3,000 years ago just laying there where they left it.
Do you feel the same strike of bolt of lightning?
Sometimes, yeah.
Now, you played some decidedly different banjos for me with decidedly different sounds. I know that you're building banjos these days. Is there something specific that you're after as you build?
I'm not interested in trying to blaze any kind of new path, or I'm really after archaic. I like the simple stuff.
Why don't you show me your shop and let's see what's on the bench.
Let's do that. When I build, I guess mostly I'm going for the earlier style, plain. I don't make fretted banjos. I haven't yet. I like fretless banjos. I mean, I like to play fretless banjos, and they're easier to build and stuff. There's something about that. Like we got a gourd banjo here. This is the most recent thing I've been working on. And this is a gourd that we grew here, and one of the hardest things. I listened to an interview with Scott Didlake, who was one of the first, contemporary gourd banjo makers. And Scott explained to this crowd of people he was talking to that he claimed that the true art of building a gourd banjo was growing the gourd itself. And I thought, well, come on. But if you actually try to grow banjo gourds, it's damn hard.
Is that a calabash? What is that?
They call it just a bottle gourd, a birdhouse gourd, but we call these calabash. It's a red oak neck, a solid red oak neck that goes through it. And the earliest banjos, gourd banjos that we have, you can see I'm still roughing it down.
Rasping it.
But the earliest gourd banjos that we know about, they go straight, the neck is just a straight piece of wood. They're actually often made from a board. They don't even have any back angle here. They're just a board that inserts, that fits tightly, snugly through the gourd. And I can actually, when this thing gets done, it'll be a pretty solid, viable instrument. What you do is once I get the head tacked on here, I'll take pins, I'll take wooden pegs, and I'll peg the gourd to the neck, and you won't be able to easily remove that. And I'll hand carve tuning pegs for this to match the sort of earlier aesthetic of that. But this is really what I'm into. The earlier, really archaic stuff kind of suits me, you know. Behind me, I've got what I mostly make now. I'm making a lot of tack heads. A friend of mine gave me a bunch of these old drum shells.
Nice.
These have some exotic wood veneered to the outside of them, so that'll be fun to work with. I'm going to have to cut these two apart. I'll make two banjos out of this, and we'll be kind of a flashy, maybe minstrel style banjo.
How many you built so far?
I think I've made 17.
Nice.
So I'm a very novice maker, and as you can see, my setup here is very basic. The older tools that you see are my grandfather's. But my dad taught me how to use a back saw, how to use a square, a file, and a rasp. The only electric tool that I've started using is I'll use an electric drill to drill holes. Everything is based around my grandfather's vise here that I got from my dad. So this vise, I'll clamp the workpiece in there, usually using a couple blocks of wood so I don't mar it up. And like, let's say I was gonna rasp on this neck, like after you leave or whatever, I'm gonna have to keep working on this. And I would put this in there, and since this is a gourd banjo and this is gonna be concealed inside the gourd, I can take a heavy piece of buffalo hide here and I'll just clamp this in there and go to work on that. And I can loosen this and draw this out.
Oh, sure.
To where I can work on that. And probably what I've been doing is rasping. I got a brand new rasp. And just trying to, I like to just do a nice even stroke on her. Now I don't do a lot of, I like to do this. And bring it down slowly. Until I get it into a shape that resembles a banjo. I'll just do that for hours and hours.
Play music while you're doing this?
I should. A lot of the time I do it in silence. So it's just nothing but the repetitive sound of the rasp.
That's magic in itself.
Yeah, there's something to it. I've got some hides. Here's where I keep all my hides so that mice and stuff can't get into them. I've got some run-of-the-mill standard goat hides. My more interesting ones I got from Jeff Menzies down in Jamaica. And Jeff must have a friend who's a butcher or something. They eat a lot of goat meat in Jamaica when they do eat meat. And so these are all these natural, sort of roughed out hides. I like to use these. And you asked about like the woods that I like to use. I like to use black walnut for the banjo neck.
Wow, beautiful billet.
It's a beautiful, it's a lovely piece of wood. If you don't stain it, if you just oil it, it's beautiful. And it can be pretty figured like that, fairly figured. Black walnut is one of our trees here that grows like weeds.
Yeah.
Other fascinating woods, I've got this and these big slabs back here. I've got several big slabs of it. This all came out of one old cherry tree that my old landlord drug up out of a riverbed in Michigan. So they call that submerged lumber. There's no way to tell how old it is. I don't have any pieces that are big enough to make a neck out of it, but I make most of my bridges, my tail pieces, tuning pegs. I like to make out of that old submerged cherry I've got. When it comes to things like maple and poplar, I don't use them as much. I have made a couple maple necks. They're fine. But for me, my true passion, if I had to pick my favorite wood, definitely be black walnut. I love black walnut. It's my favorite wood to work. It's hard to explain. It's extremely hard, but it has a softness to it. It has a waxy character to it. And I do think that it makes a good sounding neck, and also just very visually pleasing. And when you're actually working on it, when you've got it in the clamp and you're carving it, it's the most predictable and the most controllable. Red oak is real veiny and grainy, and it'll peel on you. And maple is often just like trying to carve a rock. On the road somewhere. Stanley Brothers did a version of this that they called Got a Mule to Ride. If the freight train wrecks, got a mule to ride. The freight train wreck's got a mule to ride. I won't have to catch it 'cause she's already tied. She's on the road somewhere. On the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere. Curly-headed woman won't treat me right. Curly-headed woman won't treat me right. She'll sleep all day, walk the streets at night. She's on the road somewhere. She's on the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere. If you come home and your woman wants to fight. If you come home and your woman wants to fight, pick up a chair, poke her out of sight. She's on the road somewhere. She's on the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere. Keep on drinking that bottled-in bond. You keep drinking that bottled-in bond. I save my money for the cheap old corn. She's on the road somewhere. She's on the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere. You got my woman, but you won't have her long. You got my woman, but you won't have her long. She got a new kind of lovin' greenhorn can't catch on. She's on the road somewhere. She's on the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere. If the freight train wrecks, I got a mule to ride. If the freight train wrecks, got a mule to ride. I won't have to catch it 'cause she's already tied. She's on the road somewhere. She's on the road somewhere. Well, I got me a woman on the road somewhere.